so just make yourself at home because it's a unisex bathroom. Good morning, welcome friends, welcome students, and our honored guest, Razor Dent, Texan, and Patriot. And you'll understand why when we get through listening to it. Would you all please rise and we'll give the pledge to the United States flag.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And we will now say the pledge to the Texas flag.
Behind you, Donna.
Up there?
Up there.
Oh, where? I'm sorry. It's a trick. Okay.
Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state under God, one and indivisible.
We have a flag to present to the middle school. The flag flew over the Alamo on August 20th, 2011, and it will be yours to have, and it's presented to you, especially from our chapter, in recognition of the great works that we do in this school. So keep it up, and we honor you for that. It's on that table there, Chris. You have a look at two, would you? Chrissy, where'd you go? You want to read our vignette today? Since you haven't been doing anything? And you're on foot still?
That one, sure. Good morning. Welcome. Today our Honor Day vignette is in remembrance of Gonzales Day. Gonzales is the first recognized battle of the Texas Revolution, and it was fought, of course, in Gonzales, Texas. The Texas force of 160 men challenged the Mexican military authority by refusing to surrender a brass cannon previously given to the towns as a means of protecting it against the Native Americans of Texas. The Battle of Gonzales lasted only a few minutes, but most citizens in Texas realized that there was no turning back. A war had, in fact, begun.
Now, we turn to our speaker today, Ray Dent, writes under the name Razor Dent, and you can see this is his calling card, a razor blade. I love it when I first met him and he gave me his card and I'm going, yeah. And then I realized why. Razor Dent is a Texas-born writer. He spent most of his life in the American Southwest. While working at universities in both New Mexico and Texas, he became fascinated with the area's rich history. As a U.S. Air Force pilot, instructor pilot, flying aircraft from bases in Arizona, Texas, and California, Razor gained a unique perspective on the Southwest's beauty and magnitude. Drawing on this, he weaves a distinctive blend of true events, real people, and actual places into a compelling story that uses adventure, romance, and mystery to entice his readers into becoming part of the American Southwest. Vaulted Eagles has a 5-star rating on Amazon.com based on customer reviews, and the Kindle version of the novel is currently rated 29 out of over 2,000 2,850 books in the fiction genre of family saga. Razor Dent has recently been accepted as a member of Western Writers of America. It's my privilege and honor to introduce to you Ray Dent, my good friend.
Well, it is an honor to be in the company of such a unique group of women, the daughters of the Republic of Texas. In 2004, I wrote an article for Persimmon Hill magazine. It's the publication for the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. They asked me to write a story, they commissioned me to write a story about the Alamo for their Gala Spring issue because there was a big movie coming out there. And before I started the article, I knew quite a bit about the Alamo. They knew that, that's why they asked me to write the article. Because, you see, at that point, I had already completed the Alamo segment of my novel. So I already knew quite a bit about the Alamo, but in writing this article, I learned quite a bit about the DRC. I entitled the article, "The Alamo, Hats Off to the Heroes." And this is the way it started. "Gentlemen, please remove your hats before entering. These are the words on a small black sign atop a simple stanchion, just outside the heavy wooden doors that lead into one of the most recognized structures in the world, Mission San Antonio de Valero, the Alamo, San Antonio, Texas." Then several pages later, the article ended with these words: "Gentlemen do remove their hats before entering the Alamo Church to show respect for the fallen people. One should also remove his hat in the presence of a member of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. They are indeed Texas heroes who saved the Alamo." In order for us to recognize you for your service to Texas and her citizens, would all the members of the Daughters stand up so we can thank you? One of the reasons I wrote Vaulted Eagles is that most people know virtually nothing about the rich history of the American Southwest. When I started writing Vaulted Eagles, my family and I had been living in Las Cruces and Mesilla, New Mexico for many years. Like Texas and all the Southwest, New Mexico is wiggling alive with rich history that so few people know anything about. From the 1st through the 12th grades, my two children, like every other public school student in New Mexico, never took one class in New Mexico history. My children lived in a place where Pat Garrett brought Billy the Kid in for trial and he was sentenced to hang. Less than half a mile from where my children went to the 7th grade in their junior high is the historic Mesilla Plaza. One corner of the Mesilla Plaza has an old building that used to house the Butterfield Stage Depot. For those of you who don't know, the Butterfield Stage ran for 3,000 miles from Tipton, Missouri, where the railroad ended, to San Francisco, California, in 25 days, traveling day and night. The highlight of their whole trip was the biggest place they went through on that whole journey, Mesilla, which at the time was bigger than Los Angeles. Across the street from there, in the Mesilla Plaza, is where the Gadsden purchased the sign. Now, in school, my children did take American history. They learned about the American Revolution. They studied the Boston Tea Party, they learned about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. But like all the other students in New Mexico public schools, they never studied that in Santa Fe, for example, the capital of New Mexico. On their plaza, there is a building called the Palace of the Governors. The Palace of the Governors is the oldest continuously occupied government building in the United States. In school, the students never learned that the Palace of the Governors was the first official national treasure west of the Mississippi. And it might have been nice had the children in the New Mexico public school system also learned that the Palace of the Governors was built and was the capital of this whole part of the world, including what we're visiting this morning. 10 years. 10 years before the Pilgrims even landed at Plymouth Rock in what's now Massachusetts. So, you see, the East Coast does not have all the old, rich history of the United States. I am one of the lucky ones. I was born and raised in Texas. Thank goodness our students still study Texas history. Mrs. Smith, my 7th grade history teacher, taught Texas history with a passion. She made us all proud to be Texans. So, you know, I just naturally assumed that other people who had the misfortune to be from another state were still nonetheless, you know, proud of their state and its history. And I found out that was not so. So many people have no pride in their state's heritage because all my adult life, I have had people, including my wife, a 3rd-generation New Mexican, tell me that they wish they knew about their state the way people from Texas know about them. It's always been a part of who we are. And I know that has not come easy. I know that has not come easy. There is no question that the women of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas have joined in and often led the battle to keep Texas history in our state's academic curriculum. Another thing for which we should all thank. If I could paraphrase Captain Richard King, King Ranch, it's also a character about the people. On his deathbed, Captain King said, "Never give up an inch." So when it comes to the education of the next generation of Texans, including teaching them about the incredible people and events that made this one-of-a-kind state, ladies, never give up an inch. Now, I am glad to see we've got some 7th grade history students and their parents here this morning. I was going to ask you guys to raise your hand, but I can see it. I'm really glad that you're here. I'm also quite humbled, but I'm mostly, I think, impressed that you guys love your Texas history classes so much that you give up a perfectly good Saturday morning. You can listen to a stranger talk about people who are so old they've been dead for 100 years. But I promise I will do my best to leave you with at least one valuable piece of information, or at a minimum, something that you may find interesting. Now back to Vaulted Eagles. Vaulted Eagles is a historical fiction novel set in the American Southwest. The storyline covers this astonishing little 17-year span in which Mexico descended from its stature as the 2nd largest country in the world for the size she is today. And the American West. In the course of writing Vaulted Eagles, I actually met many of your forefathers. The men and women whose brave souls and strong hearts created this great state of Texas. You see, I met some of your forefathers because I really did travel back in time. I looked in libraries, archives, and I found this very rare little window that opened between 1836 and 1853. And when I crawled through that little window, I met some extraordinary people. And I spent time getting to know some of them pretty well. I ran into some famous people back there, like Stephen F. Austin and Jim Bowie and Kit Carson. But some of the most extraordinary individuals I met were people who are not that well known necessarily. They were men and women who were just as historically relevant, just as brave, just as colorful as the famous ones, but most of us have never heard that much about. I'm talking about people like Moses Austin, and Erasmo Seguin, and Emily Morgan, and Jack Shackelford, and Juan Seguin. There were so many of those incredible people I spent time getting to know who became characters in my mind. But there was one fellow I met and spent quite a bit of time with. His name is very famous, like David Crockett or Sam Houston. But most people seem to know very little about this guy. The fellow's name is Antonio Lopez. Antonio ruled Mexico 11 different times during the 1880s. But most people only know Antonio for one thing he did, and that was during his very first presidency. Honestly, compared to all the other things Antonio did, that one was actually relatively small. The only thing that most of us know about Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna Perez de Lebrón is that he led the Mexican army against the Texas rebels at the Battle of the Alamo. Today, we usually just call Antonio Santa Anna, or here in Texas, Santa Anna. In my opinion, Santa Anna was one of the most important men in American history. He not only shook the lives of your forefathers directly, he has also significantly touched the lives of every generation of your family since. Let me briefly introduce you before we continue. I'll start as Santa Anna and his men are on a 1,000-mile trek northward from Ciudad Mexico up to the fighting at the Alamo in San Antonio de Padre. And for you guys who are doing this, you might also think about the last time you took a 1,000-mile car trip. Traveling with an army was tedious. The larger the force, the more slowly they moved. Although he loved the sights and sounds and smells of war, Santa Anna hated moving with his army. He hated the pace and he hated the monotony. He longed for a diversion and cursed himself for the lack of judgment in not taking even one mistress along on this campaign. He looked ahead to the small hill he'd been watching since noon the day before. He judged it to be perfect. It was not too high, so the men would be able to see him clearly. The battalions would move along its west side, so the morning sun would be at his back, and he wouldn't have to look into it as he waited for them to pass. Keep your columns moving, he ordered boldly to the generals, plodding their horses along slowly on either side. Santa Anna spurred his great white horse and galloped ahead, veering right toward the small hill. He rode to the top of the little rounded mound that was completely bare of any vegetation except for the tall yellow grass. It did not give him enough elevation to see the very back of the long winding procession below him, but it served his purpose well. When he stopped, he struck a stately but comfortable pose atop the large white gelding. His mounts were the only pure white horses allowed. Aside from accenting Santa Anna's elegant military uniforms, he felt the animal's color symbolized to the ranks his position as a pure divine leader. He also knew that in the heat of a battle, his soldiers would be able to readily see the big white horse and would rally around him and protect the person sitting there. To his admirable Mexican army, marching proudly below his vantage, Santa Anna knew he would look like a god astride the great mythical Pegasus, silhouetted against the morning sky. To the heavily loaded, poor, conscripted souls who raised their tired eyes to El Presidente as they passed on their endless trudge through the desert. He did. Santa Anna could see the heads of his soldiers turn to look up at him as they stepped in loose ranks at his feet. He turned his own head and surveyed the vast countryside. He ruled everything he could see, and everything beyond the horizon, in every direction. I am convinced. He thought as the majesty of the moment inspired him. The chapter goes on from there. But that was just a brief blush at Santa Anna and things to come. And both of you want to get to know him much better. But now I will give you just a couple of examples of things that I saw when I went back and met Santa Anna. Then I'll outline only a few of the reasons why I think he's so important to our American history. Then I'll close with a personal note from my research. But just so you can start getting to know Santa Anna for a moment, consider. Have you ever wondered why ordinary people in Texas fought so hard at the Battle of the Alamo to the last man? Or why the outnumbered Texas volunteers, ordinary people with Sam Houston at the Battle of San Jacinto, attacked Santa Anna's army with such a fury that they killed some 600 Mexican soldiers and captured 700 in 18 minutes. One of the reasons was because they knew what Santa Anna was capable of if he were loose in the heartlands of Texas. The reason they knew this is because the spring before the Battle of the Alamo, there was unrest in several of the other Mexican states. One of them was the silver-rich state of Zacatecas. The people there were outraged over losing their right to bear arms. So a year before the Battle of the Alamo, Santa Anna took his forces to confront the rebellious citizens in that state's capital city, which was also named Zacatecas. First thing Santa Anna did was send several of his best officers to that city feigning defection. They swore to the people their allegiance to Mexico's democratic constitution of 1824 and their hatred for Santa Anna. Well, the citizens believed their lies, and because these were trained military leaders, they were given command positions with the Zacatecan rebels. So Santa Anna approached the city with his army. Then he swung around and attacked him from the rear. With his men in charge of much of the militia, there was a wholesale slaughter of the armed resistance in less than a day. Then it took Santa Anna 2 more days to kill another 2,500 men, women, and children of that city who had not participated in the fighting, but who Santa Anna deemed, no trial, no game, he deemed them sympathizers in resistance. He made specific examples of the foreigners and hated foreigners in this country, particularly the English and the American. What he did to those men and their wives is not for discussion at a group like this. But after he finished killing anyone, even remotely connected with the rebellion, he unleashed his army to the village. Remember, these are Mexican citizens, his own people in Mexico. Finally, he set that beautiful Mexican city to the torch. Now, remember, at this point, we're not past Santa Anna's first of 11 different times of life. Believe me, it only gets more extraordinary from here. If there were time, I could give you myriad examples of things that I saw when I was back there. But I do want to jump forward. I want to move ahead in time briefly here and talk about the Gadsden Purchase. because it was a very important part of Santa Ana's life and our history. My experience has been that if I ask you who's heard of the Gaston Purchase, everybody would raise their hand. And then if I said, okay, who can tell me exactly what it was, most of the hands were down. So, in short, you'll remember that when Santa Ana lost the Mexican-American War, Mexico ceded to the United States, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all the lands that were contested parts of Texas. Mexico also ceded to the United States all the lands in what is now the state of New Mexico, all the land that, what part of Colorado, parts of Wyoming, Arizona, the state of Utah, all the land that's now the state of Nevada, and all the land that is now the state of California. America's manifest destiny had been fulfilled. She suddenly reached from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So, within about 5 years, the United States was trying to figure out how to connect the East Coast with the West Coast by way of the Transcontinental Railroad. Imagine that. It was only in 1806 when Lewis and Clark led the first expedition all the way to the Pacific Ocean for Thomas Jefferson. And now they were going to connect the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Well, Santa Ana had fled Mexico at the end of the Mexican-American War. But through some bizarre twists and turns, Santa Ana was back in power, ruling Mexico, when the United States President, Franklin Pierce, sent this fellow named James Gaston as minister to Mexico in order to negotiate to buy land for a southern route for this transcontinental railroad. You see, even with all this land, the United States had determined that because of the terrain, it would be too difficult to build a railroad up north. So Pierce sent Gaston to negotiate with Santa Ana to purchase land through the deserts of New Mexico for a southern route for this transcontinental railroad. For up to $50 million. Out of land for the Transcontinental Railroad in Lower California, possible for up to $50 million. That's $50 million. Gaston negotiated with Santa Ana in Mexico City. 14 days before they signed what came to be known as the Gaston Purchase, Santa Ana declared herself most serene highness and perpetual dictator. Relax. In the treaty that they signed, the United States would get a lot of land in northern Mexico and the entire Baja Peninsula for $15 million. That's $15 million. Of course, the treaty had to be ratified by the United States Congress. I think you will find this very interesting. In my research, I found evidence that points to the fact that back then they had very partisan, self-serving, short-sighted, idiot politicians, very similar to some of the ones that you see, at this point, California had come into the Union as a free state. So the free states outnumbered the slave states in Congress. Consequently, the free states were winning every time they voted in. So in Congress, they became afraid that someday, maybe potentially, the Baja Peninsula could come into the Union as a state. And if that happened, perhaps, maybe, who knows, it might come in as a slave state, which would mess up their little send-off. So the U.S. Congress, in their wisdom, changed the agreement with Santa Ana. They took out the entire Baja Peninsula and all the other land in northern Mexico, except for up to where the borders for the states of New Mexico and Arizona exist today. They took all that out and reduced the purchase price to pennies. But you have to look at it this way. We bought all the land south of the Gila River to where these state borders exist today. We bought about 30,000 square miles for $10 million. It's not like it was a bad deal. Excuse me, Christmas. Anyway, that agreement was consummated in that plaza in Lucia in what is now New Mexico. I will tell you here that the original seed that was planted that resulted in the novel Vaulted Eagles came at a meeting I attended on that plaza in Lucia, when someone from the Museums of New Mexico raised the question about whether or not the money paid for the Gaston purchase ever actually made it to the Mexican trade. Well, now that you've heard about a couple of the events I witnessed, let me summarize a few of the reasons why I think Santa Anna was one of the most important men in American history. To begin with, and this is just for my friends who I hope are at least getting some kind of extra credit or something besides these pearls of wisdom on a Saturday. This is just for you guys. It is widely accepted among many historians that Santa Anna brought chewing gum to the United States. You see, about a year after the U.S. president finally signed the Gaston Purchase, and the Mexican people found out what Santa Anna had done, he was exiled out of Mexico again, about 1855. Around 1869, Santa Anna, in exile, wound up for a while in Staten Island, New York. Santa Anna had always been fond of chewing this substance in Central America called chicle. While he was in New York, Santa Anna met a man named Thomas Adams. Because of his association with Santa Anna, Adams wound up with a good supply of this chicle when Santa Anna left. Shortly thereafter, Thomas Adams founded the Adams Chewing Company and was responsible for what later evolved into a product called chiclets. There are other reasons why we might acknowledge Santa Anna's importance in American history. For example, Mexico's Democratic Constitution of 1824 was drafted by solid men like Erasmo Seguin, Juan Seguin's father. Erasmo, some of you know, he was the postmaster for San Antonio for 25 years, served as the alcalde or the mayor for... Anyway, had Santa Anna not abolished that constitution so early in his first presidency, Mexico might have become a democracy. Had that happened, we might all still be speaking Spanish as well. Another thing, because of Santa Anna's centralist policy, the Tejanos, the original native-born Mexicans living in Texas, and the American colonists who became Mexican citizens in order to settle in Texas, they were afraid that under Santa Anna's dictatorship, they would lose everything they worked so hard for. And if you couple that with things like Santa Anna's harsh retributions against anybody that opposed it, a couple of examples. That would be when he used some 1,800 Mexican soldiers to kill about 189 or so brave men at the Battle of the Alamo on Sunday. And then 3 weeks later, to the day, on Palm Sunday, executing over 400 unarmed prisoners under the command of James Fannin at La Bahia, a place we now call Joliet. I believe that through his actions, Santa Anna was directly responsible for the birth of the Republic of Texas, which is now, of course, the greatest state in the Union and the 6th largest economy in the world. Also, Santa Anna was president of Mexico and commander of the army when Mexico lost the Mexican-American War. So if for no other reason, I believe that Santa Anna was one of the most important men in American history because in less than 20 years, Santa Anna either lost in battle or sold over half of Mexico's sovereign land. of which is now part of the United States of America, including this library. So in closing, a personal note from my research. I know these continue to be trying times for the UAP, but remember, I have met some of your forefathers. You ladies are part of the fabric of Texas. Courage and fortitude. Oh, I'm doing it. They're in your DNA. You can't help but use them. It may be a little difficult, but you will be just fine. Thank you so much for having me.
We have a little gift for our speaker. And
Thank you so much.
very moving words. We appreciate so much.
Thank you for having me.
That takes care of our speech, and our friend, we thank so much for coming. And yeah, we can be dismissed now, and you kids, you can go play.